I'm Jacqueline, 32. The air in the federal district court in Chicago was always cold, but today it felt frozen. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the polished floor. To my right, my mother, Danielle, let out a sigh so loud it echoed off the mahogany benches. Then she did it, the eye roll. The theatrical, full-body eye roll she reserved for moments when my existence inconvenienced her. It was a signal to everyone in the room. Here comes the disappointment. Here comes the freelance failure. But then, the atmosphere shattered. Judge Brennan looked up from the docket. His eyes didn't gloss over me like everyone else's. They locked onto mine, and widened. He froze, his pen hovering over the paperwork. The silence in the room grew heavy as he stared, not at a defendant, but at someone he recognized, someone he respected. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The charges are against you?" I froze right there in the aisle. "Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone underestimated you, only to watch their faces change when they realized who you really were? I'd love to hear your story." To my parents, Danielle and Jared, I was Jacqueline, the freelance bookkeeper, the one who lived in a cramped apartment, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and scraped by on odd jobs. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about at country club dinners, the one with so much potential who just failed to launch. They saw my silence at family gatherings as shame. They saw my modest clothes as evidence of poverty. What they didn't see was the badge in my pocket. They didn't see the security clearance level that would make their investment banker friends sweat. I wasn't a freelancer. I was a ghost, a high-level forensic auditor for the federal government. My job wasn't to balance checkbooks for small businesses. It was to hunt financial predators. I tracked embezzlement schemes, dismantled money laundering operations, and built cases that put corrupt CEOs in federal prison. I never corrected them. Why would I? Their indifference was my shield. It was easier to let them believe I was a failure than to explain my life to people who only understood value in terms of visible assets. If I had told them the truth that I made more in a month than my father's failing tech startup made in a year, they wouldn't have been proud. They would have asked for a loan. Standing there in the courtroom, I could smell my mother's perfume. It was Chanel, heavy and floral, meant to mask the scent of desperation that had clung to my parents for years. It clashed with the smell I was used to, the ink and dust of my grandfather's study, the ozone smell of a server room, the metallic tang of fear when a suspect realizes I've found the hidden account. You see, my parents operated on a very specific kind of math. It's what I call the narcissist's math. To them, people aren't people. They are assets or liabilities. It's a transactional ledger, where love is a currency to be hoarded, not shared. If you have money, status, or connections they can use, you're an asset. You get the smiles, the praise, the seat at the head of the table. But if you don't, if you're quiet, if you're private, if you don't flash wealth they can leverage, then you're a liability. You're a drain on their social capital. In their ledger, I was a bad investment. I offered no return on the 18 years they'd spent housing me, so they wrote me off. They depreciated my value to zero. And because they had decided I was worth nothing, they assumed the rest of the world saw me that way too. They assumed that when they dragged me into court, the judge would see a broke, desperate daughter trying to steal from her elders. They didn't know that the judge sitting on the bench was a man I had trained. They didn't know that 3 years ago, before he was Your Honor, he was just Marcus, a junior prosecutor struggling to follow a paper trail in a RICO case, until I sat him down and taught him how to follow the money. They thought they were bringing a lamb to the slaughter. They didn't realize they had just walked into the lion's den, and the lion was already awake. The silence in the house was heavier than the funeral procession. My grandfather, Justice Arthur Sterling, had been buried 3 hours ago. But the air still felt thick with unresolved tension. I sat in the library, the leather chair swallowing me whole, watching the rain streak against the windowpane. It was fitting weather for the end of an era. Then the front door burst open. My parents, Danielle and Jared, stormed in, shaking off their umbrellas like wet dogs. They weren't wearing black. They were wearing anticipation. They didn't look like people who had just buried a father. They looked like people who were about to win the lottery. They walked straight past me, barely acknowledging my existence, and headed for the attorney who was setting up his briefcase at the mahogany desk. To them, this wasn't a time for grief. It was a liquidity event. Their failing tech startups were bleeding cash, their mortgage was underwater, and they had been counting down the days until this moment. They believed the reading of the will was just a formality before the wire transfer. The attorney, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. He began reading in a monotone voice, listing assets that made my parents' eyes widen. The estate was valued at $14.5 million. Real estate, stocks, bonds. It was a fortune. Danielle gripped Jared's hand, her knuckles white. I could practically hear them calculating how much debt they could pay off, how many new leases they could sign. Then came the sentence that sucked the oxygen out of the room. To my daughter Danielle and her husband Jared, I leave nothing. The entirety of my estate, including all properties and liquid assets, is bequeathed to my granddaughter, Jacqueline. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was explosive. What? Danielle shrieked, jumping to her feet. That's a mistake. Read it again. It's not a mistake, Mr. Henderson said calmly. It's a fortress. The language is explicit. Jared turned on me, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage. You did this, he spat. You poisoned him against us. You were here every day, whispering in his ear, while we were busy building an empire. Building an empire? I repeated, my voice quiet but steady. Is that what you call bankruptcy? Don't you dare, Danielle hissed. This is constructive fraud. You took advantage of a sick old man. You manipulated him. This is elder abuse, Jacqueline, and we are going to sue you for everything you're worth. I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, I didn't see parents. I saw suspects. I saw desperate people looking for a scapegoat. In my mind, I opened the red ledger. It was a physical book my grandfather kept in his top drawer, a habit from his days on the bench. He tracked everything. Not just money, but time. Every hour I spent managing his medications. Every night I slept in the chair next to his bed when he was sick. Every weekend I spent organizing his library. And on the other side of the ledger, their absences, the missed birthdays, the holidays spent in Aspen while he was in the hospital, the excuses, too busy, can't get away, work is crazy. They thought the inheritance was a gift. They thought they were entitled to it by blood. But I knew the truth. It wasn't a gift. It was back pay. It was compensation for 30 years of unpaid caregiving, for being the only person who actually showed up. Go ahead and sue, I said, standing up. But remember one thing. In a court of law, receipts matter more than tantrums. Jared laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You think you're smart because you tricked a dying man? We have lawyers who will eat you alive. You're going to wish you never accepted a dime. They stormed out as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the front door wide open to the rain. I walked over and closed it, locking the deadbolt. The click echoed in the empty house. It sounded like a gavel coming down. They had declared war. They wanted a fight? Fine. I was a forensic auditor. I didn't fight with emotions. I fought with evidence. And I had a feeling that before this was over, they were going to regret ever opening the books on this family. Winter settled over Chicago, but the heat coming from my phone was enough to burn the apartment down. My parents didn't wait for a court date to start their offensive. They launched a whisper campaign that would have impressed a wartime propagandist. They called every family friend, every distant cousin, every associate my grandfather had ever known. They painted a portrait of a tragedy. Two loving, devoted parents pushed out by a predatory daughter who had preyed on a senile old man. They spun a narrative where they were the victims of parental alienation, where I had blocked their calls and intercepted their letters. Jared left voicemails that were masterpieces of gaslighting. We know what you did, Jacqueline. His voice hissed through the speaker, alternating between rage and fake sorrow. We know you forced him to sign that will. We were trying to save him, but you blocked us at every turn. You stole our time with him. I didn't delete the messages. I didn't cry into my pillow about the unfairness of it all. I archived them. I backed them up to a secure server. To me, their lies weren't emotional wounds. They were admissible evidence of malice. While they were busy winning the court of public opinion at the country club, I went to work. I treated my own life like a case file. I set up a war room in my dining area, 3 monitors, a pot of black coffee, and the red ledger sitting in the center like a Bible. I started the audit. I cross-referenced my grandfather's handwritten notes in the ledger against 25 years of bank statements. The ledger was meticulous. He had recorded every loan requested by my father, every emergency fund demanded by my mother. But as I dug deeper into the digital archives, the numbers stopped adding up. There was a discrepancy. A massive one. I found a series of recurring wire transfers starting 20 years ago. Small amounts at first, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Labeled as consulting fees or angel investment capital. They went to entities with generic names like Phoenix Ventures and Summit Holdings. I ran a trace on the entities. It took me less than an hour to pierce the corporate veil. They were shell companies, and the registered agent for every single one of them? Jared. My father hadn't just been asking for handouts, he had been siphoning money. He had been systematically embezzling from my grandfather's accounts under the guise of legitimate business investments that never existed. I tracked the flow of funds. The money didn't go to research and development. It went to luxury car leases, 5-star resorts in Aspen, and paying off credit card debt that accumulated faster than interest. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark room. The total amount siphoned over 2.5 decades was $2.4 million. The realization hit me with the cold precision of a sniper shot. They weren't suing me because they thought the will was unfair. They were suing me because they were terrified. They knew that if a probate court looked too closely at the estate's history, the theft would be exposed. They needed to control the narrative, and they needed to control the assets to bury the paper trail. They thought they were dealing with a daughter who could be bullied into a settlement. They forgot they were dealing with a forensic auditor who hunted people like them for sport. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter who just found the blood trail. I printed the spreadsheet. I organized the bank records. I compiled the shell company registrations. I clipped everything together into a thick, heavy file. I took a marker and wrote Exhibit A on the tab. They wanted a trial? I was going to give them an autopsy. Back in the courtroom, the air felt heavy with the weight of unsaid truths. The parents' high-priced lawyer, a man with a suit sharper than his wit, paced before the jury box. He painted a picture of a devoted daughter overwhelmed by the complexities of her grandfather's estate. A woman whose grief had clouded her judgment. He called into question my competence, my understanding of finance, even my love for the man who raised me. I sat there, stone-faced, letting his words wash over me like rain on a windshield. I didn't flinch. I didn't object. I waited. Then, the trial shifted. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his gaze piercing through the theatrics. He interrupted the proceedings, his voice calm but commanding. "Before we proceed," he said, addressing my parents directly, "I have a few questions for the plaintiffs." Danielle and Jared exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't part of the script. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge began, "can you tell the court what your daughter's official job title is?" Danielle blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Well, she does freelance work. Bookkeeping, I believe. And you, Mr. Sterling?" The judge turned to my father. "Do you know?" Jared cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "She's in finance. Freelance. It's complicated." "It's actually quite simple," Judge Brennan said, his voice dropping an octave. "She is a senior forensic auditor for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She specializes in high-level financial crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a physical thing, pressing against the eardrums of everyone in the room. My parents stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "One more question," the judge continued, relentless. "What was your father's favorite book?" Silence. "His favorite meal?" Silence. "The name of his first dog?" Silence. "Let the record show," Judge Brennan said, his voice ringing with finality, "that the plaintiffs cannot answer basic questions about the deceased or the defendant. This speaks to a profound absence, a neglect that goes beyond mere distance." He turned to me, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Miss Jacqueline, please present your findings." I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit. I walked to the front of the room, carrying the thick file labeled Exhibit A. I placed it on the evidence table with a deliberate thud. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear. "This file contains 25 years of bank records, shell company registrations, and wire transfer confirmations. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that my parents, Danielle and Jared Sterling, embezzled $2.4 million from my grandfather's estate." The gasps from the gallery were audible. My parents looked like they had been struck by lightning. The color drained from their faces, leaving them as pale as the marble columns outside. "They didn't just neglect him," I continued, locking eyes with my mother. "They stole from him. They treated him like a piggy bank, and when the money ran out, they came for me." I turned back to the judge. The defense rests. The empty chair verdict had been delivered. The truth was out, laid bare for all to see. And in that moment, I knew I had won. Not just the case, but my freedom. Judge Brennan didn't waste time with a lecture. He didn't give them a speech about morality or family values. He simply banged his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Case dismissed with prejudice," he said, his voice flat. "Furthermore, in light of the evidence presented regarding the embezzlement of estate funds, I am referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. We're adjourned." The bailiff moved to open the doors, but my parents didn't move. They sat frozen, the color drained from their faces, looking like two statues carved from salt. The reality of what had just happened was settling in. They hadn't just lost the money, they had lost their immunity. I packed up my files with slow, deliberate movements. I slotted Exhibit A back into my briefcase. I clicked my pen shut. I didn't look at them until I was standing in the aisle, ready to leave. That's when they moved. They scrambled out of their seats, stumbling over each other to get to me before I reached the exit. The aggression that had fueled them for months had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. "Jacqueline?" my mother gasped, reaching for my arm. I stepped back, out of range. "Jacqueline, honey, wait. Please. We need to talk," Jared said, his voice shaking. "The judge. He misunderstood. We can fix this. We're family. You can't let them send us to prison." I looked at them, really looked at them. For 30 years, I had searched their faces for affection, for approval, for any sign that I mattered. Now, I scanned them like a balance sheet. I saw the fear in my mother's eyes, the sweat on my father's brow. They were insolvent, morally and financially bankrupt. "I didn't do this," I said, my tone clinical. "You did. You opened the audit. I just finished it." "We were desperate," Jared pleaded. "The businesses. The loans. We were drowning. Your grandfather, he had so much. He didn't need it. We were going to pay it back." "No," I said, "you weren't." I reached into my briefcase again. But I didn't pull out a lawsuit. I pulled out a single, thin blue folder. "There is one more thing," I said. "Something the will reading didn't cover because it wasn't part of the probate estate." My father stared at the folder, sweat dripping down his temple. "What is that?" "Grandfather didn't just watch you steal from him," I said. "He was a federal judge. He knew exactly what you were doing with those shell companies. He knew about the bad loans you took out to cover your tracks. He knew about the second mortgage on the house you can't afford." I took a step closer. 5 years ago, he set up a blind trust. He used it to purchase the distressed debt from your creditors. He bought the notes on your failing businesses. He bought the lien on your house. I handed the folder to Jared. He took it with trembling hands. "He left the blind trust to me," I said. "I'm not just the defendant, Jared. I am your creditor. I own your mortgage. I own your business loans. You don't owe the bank anymore. You owe me." Danielle let out a small, strangled sound. Jared opened the folder. Inside wasn't a check. It was a repayment schedule, a strict, non-negotiable timeline for every cent they had stolen, plus the debt they had accrued. "You have 30 days to make the first installment," I said, checking my watch. "If you miss a payment, I foreclose. If you are late, I liquidate your assets. You wanted a relationship with me? Now you have one. It's a debtor-creditor relationship. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. Read the fine print, I said, turning my back on them for the last time. Interest accrues daily. I walked out of the courtroom doors and didn't look back. Behind me, I heard the folder hit the floor. I walked out of the federal building into the Chicago wind. It didn't bite this time. It felt like a cleansing breath, stripping away the ozone smell of the courtroom and the cloying scent of my mother's perfume. I didn't look back at the doors. I didn't check my phone to see if they had called. I knew they wouldn't. They were too busy reading the repayment schedule I had handed them. I drove straight to the cemetery. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass slick and green. I walked to the simple granite marker that bore my grandfather's name. Justice Arthur Sterling. I didn't bring flowers. I brought results. It's done, I told the stone. The accounts are reconciled. I stood there for a long time, thinking about the $14.5 million that was now legally mine. To my parents, that money was a lifestyle. It was status. It was a way to buy the admiration they couldn't earn. But, to me, it was a tool. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't buy a yacht or a sports car. That is the language of people like Jared and Danielle. And I don't speak their dialect. Instead, I established the Sterling Scholarship for Forensic Accounting. It's a full-ride program, but it has a specific eligibility requirement. It is exclusively for foster youth. It's for the kids who know what it's like to be invisible, who know what it's like to be overlooked by the system. I am going to give them the education, the clearance, and the skills to become ghosts. I am going to build an army of auditors who know how to hunt down the people who exploit the vulnerable. Grandfather would have liked that. He believed in justice. I believe in enforcement. I sat down on the stone bench next to his grave and pulled the red ledger out of my bag. The leather was worn, the pages soft from years of handling. It contained the history of my life, the debt of presents I had paid, the theft my parents had committed, the long, slow math of our family's destruction. For a moment, I considered burning it. Watching the evidence turn to ash felt like the cinematic thing to do. But I am an auditor. We don't destroy records, we archive them. I took a pen from my pocket and turned to the final page. Beneath the last calculation of the embezzlement, beneath the dates of the missed birthdays and the silent holidays, I wrote one final entry. Paid in full. I closed the book. The weight in my chest, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying since I was a child, simply evaporated. I drove home to my quiet apartment. It didn't feel cramping or small anymore. It felt secure. It felt solvent. That night, I didn't dream about courtrooms or bank statements. I slept through the night for the first time in 10 years. No noise. No guilt. Just the perfect, heavy silence of a balanced book. If you've ever had to become your own hero because the people who were supposed to protect you failed, share this video. You aren't alone, and your ledger is balanced now. Thanks for watching.